Okay, well, we might get started. Find the start of my notes, be a good start. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming out on a Sunday afternoon to be at our Climate Election Forum in Adelaide. I'm Deanna, and I'll be your MC for this afternoon's discussion. Now, is the mic working okay? That's my dad, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay at the back? All good? Great. So firstly, we'd like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is the land of the Kaurna people. We pay our respects to elders, both past, present, and emerging. And we acknowledge that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. In the case of an emergency, hopefully you can see the two emergency exits. If you do need the bathrooms, they're just out this door and to your left. If you haven't already, can you please put your phones on silent so we don't interrupt our lovely panel up here this afternoon? However, while you've got your phones out, if you are on social media, please do take photos and share and check yourself in. We'd love you to hashtag climate election and Adelaide. And if you keep those phones out a minute longer, we're going to try something new this afternoon. After our first half of a facilitated discussion, we would absolutely like to get questions from the audience. But what we'd ask is for you to text your questions in during the first half. So the number is 044 774 3373. And if you didn't quite catch that, hopefully you've seen the number up on the walls around you. So please, during this first half of our conversation up here, text in any questions you have for the panel, and we will then read them out in the second half of this afternoon. And last but not least, I think it's fair to say, maybe not as stark without the Labor and Liberal representatives here, but we probably still will have some diversity of views across the panel and the audience today. And we'd love to make today a safe and respectful place and hopefully have a really constructive conversation together. So for those who don't know, today was not organised by an established organisation. It was organised by a group of 8 local people in Adelaide. Each of us knew somebody in the group, and we've actually become friends through it. So that's one thing we have climate change to thank for. So a quick shout out to Nyan, Lynn, Kieran, Ollie, Joel, Ruth and Leanne, some of whom you might have met on the way in. We're all really sick of hearing more and more negative stories in the news about climate change and having endless conversations with friends and families that go round in circles and more often than not in downward spirals. Nyan said to me one day, "What can we actually do?" And it all began from there. So thanks for coming out today. And now an introduction to our panel. We have in the middle here Professor Corey Bradshaw, who is the Matthew Flinders Fellow in Global Ecology, Director of the Global Ecology Lab at Flinders Uni, and Head of the Flinders Modelling Node at the Centre of Excellence for Australian Biodiversity and Heritage. He has published over 275 peer-reviewed scientific articles, 11 book chapters and 3 books, assuming that's up to date. Noah Schultz-Byard, down the end here, is an Adelaide-based freelance writer, and today he joins us as the South Australian representative for the Australia Institute, a progressive, independent think tank that conducts research on a broad range of economic, social, transparency and environmental issues. To my right here, we've got Doha Khan, who is a 17-year-old high school student from Glenunga International High School. She is also the lead organiser of the School Strike for Climate movement in Adelaide, which held a strike and rally for thousands in the city last month. Now, I feel a little bad after all of those claps, but we haven't written a long bio for each of our political candidates today. They each have exceptionally long stories to tell, so please look them up online afterwards. But I would especially like to thank Independent Senator Tim Storer, Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, and Professor Barbara Pocock, Greens candidate for Adelaide, for taking the time out of their weekend and coming to our forum today. I would also like to mention that we did invite both Liberal and Labor candidates from Hindmarsh and Adelaide electorates, all of whom declined. We then invited all the SA senators who are up for re-election, and we have two that did attend today. So it is a bit disappointing that the two major parties didn't send a representative, but I would like to make a special mention of Katarina from Labor MP Mark Butler's office, who did consistently get back to me and show that they were trying to find someone who was available, but unfortunately that didn't come through. Shall we get started? Okay. In 2015, over 170 countries came together and signed what's known as the Paris Agreement, which aimed to limit the global average temperature from rising to 1.5 degrees Celsius or more above pre-industrial levels. Australia is a party to this agreement and committed to reduce our emissions by 26 to 28% from 2005 levels by 2030, a goal that some would say isn't enough. The government's own projections currently show we are not on track to meet our target, and national emissions are actually increasing. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC's most recent report, has warned that we only have about a decade left to make urgent and unprecedented but achievable changes to meet the Paris Agreement, 1.5% degrees global warming. So we'll start with Professor Corey Bradshaw. We've already failed to act on climate change and to stop it. Can you tell us what the consequences we are already set to face at a 1.5 degree warming, and what difference will it make if we don't meet our agreed targets and the world warms by 2 degrees? And in particular, how will that affect us here in Australia?
Oh, yeah. Summarise not only my entire career, but that of almost all my colleagues in, 2 minutes? The 2 points I want to make is, first of all, there is no threshold. It's a sliding scale. So whether it's 1 degree or 1.5 or 2 or 4 or 10, it doesn't really matter. Every increment is worse than the lower amount. So we've given ourselves somewhat arbitrary thresholds. I hear often 10, 12 years. That's just for an arbitrary threshold itself. So there is really no time where it's more convenient or how much time we have left. We have to do something big now. So in terms of a difference of 0.5 degrees, it sort of depends at what end of the scale you're in, because you're losing probably more at this end of the scale as opposed to the bottom end. We've done modeling that showed that you can elicit pretty much planetary-wide annihilation of all life with between 4 to 6 degrees of warming. And that tends to match what we see in the fossil record. So the Permian extinction, where about 95% of all species went extinct about 250 million years ago, that was about a 5 to 6 degree range. It's actually, interestingly enough, it's worse on the heating side than in the cooling side. And in fact, the projections now over the course of the next century between the kind of ranges we're talking to 2100, we're looking at basic single species predictions of between about 15 and 20% total extinctions. Now, we've done other work to show that that's probably underestimating by about 10 times the extinction rate. So if you do back of the envelope calculations, a 0.5 degree warming probably would elicit about 10% of all species on the planet going extinct. Okay, so that's within the next few decades. That's not centuries. Even when I wrote that paper, I mean, I'm a pessimist, and I'm going to try to end on a high note, which is hard for me. They call me Dr. Doom usually. But when we wrote the paper on the underestimation of extinction rates, it even depressed me more than I usually am, and I'm used to this sort of thing. In terms of just everyday life, you're looking at about a 6% reduction in world wheat production for every degree of warming. The extinction cascades that will give you roughly that 10% range of extinctions are everything from pollinating insects right through to elephants. Now, we ultimately depend on all of the life, so it depends which species go first. It tends to be the ones that can't move as fast, so the plants and then the smaller insects. But those small insects, just to give you an example, 1/3 of every mouthful of food is due to an animal pollinator, and half of that comes from one species. Any guesses what that is? Honeybees. Yet worldwide, we're starting to see insect cascades. Not so much extinctions yet because they're hard to detect, but in Puerto Rico, in Germany, in Britain, and even in Australia. Who can, for those of you that are over 40, let's say, who can remember driving with their parents and every 50 kilometers having to stop off the side of the road and wash the bug splat off your windscreen? When's the last time that happened? It doesn't, because this anecdotal mind, but we're seeing not only the big things go extinct, which are supposed to go extinct first, we're seeing the smallest things go extinct. And that's just the cascading effects through the ecosystem. The direct effects, heat waves, we're already seeing in the last 50 years, we're seeing a doubling in the return times of heat waves. And of course, we don't tend to respond to the mean temperature. You know, the 25 degrees, that's the mean for Adelaide over the course of the last 50 years. We respond to the extreme events. That's when the red river gums start to die. That's when young people, immunocompromised people, sick people, older people will die. We have extreme weather events that will come in and knock out our power system, for example. There's all sorts of cascading effects that's driven by the extreme. And when you knock up the distribution of extreme temperatures, for example, there's other components of climate, obviously. For example, a 1 degree rise in this area will increase the probability of an extreme event by over double. So it's not just like you get a few extra days at the end of summer for Barbies and more beer and perhaps a longer growing season. You actually over double the frequency of an intense heat wave that knocks out things. And of course, that happens more and more frequently. So, coming back, how long's a piece of string? It's every little bit of increment is bad.
Thank you so much. We might jump over to Noah now. Noah, this is all well and good, and I think that Professor Bradshaw could probably tell us a lot more all afternoon. But really, politicians are elected to represent the Australian people. So can you tell us, obviously there's people here that care about climate change, but do we really represent the majority of Australians? What does the electorate think?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I am a natural optimist, which means hopefully by the end of my short little bit we'll be able to heave a sigh of relief about how far the conversation has gone when it comes to the potential impacts of global warming and the population's understanding of how important it is for us to take action. So at the Australia Institute, we're an independent think tank mainly based in Canberra, but have just started with me here in South Australia doing some work in Adelaide. We do a lot of research, but we also do a lot of polling. And the polling we do for a range of reasons, but mainly because it's extremely important for the people who are in office, the politicians, but also the candidates and those who are hoping to become politicians, to understand where the public is on a range of issues. One of the reasons it's important, and the first example I'll use, is the pretty much entirely unhinged national discussion we've been having around electric vehicles over the last week. So, a little over a week ago, the Labor Party came out with a policy that they want to see 50% of new vehicles sold by 2030 to be fully electric. And all hell broke loose. Scott Morrison said that it's going to end the weekend and they're coming for the keys to your ute and they're going to make barbecues illegal and anything he could think of. It then, of course, came out that the coalition's policy is factoring in 25 to 50% new vehicle sales being electric by 2030 anyway, but we thought it was important to look at what the Australian people think about this idea, or going even further on electric vehicles. The Greens have a policy of 100% of new vehicle sales by 2030 being electric. One of the questions we asked was, how do you feel about the idea of 100% of new vehicle sales being fully electric by the year 2025. So this was an even more optimistic strategy than any of the mainstream parties are putting forward. And the results came back exactly at 1 in 2 Australians supporting the idea. So 50% of Australians support 100% electric vehicles by 2025, of new sold vehicles being electric. It's a stark example of the political discussion being completely out of step with where the population is at. Another quick example is 100% renewable energy in South Australia by 2030. That was one of the calls being made by the school strikers, one of the 3 planks of the position on the day of action. It's also Greens policy, 100% renewable energy by 2030. We asked in South Australia, we're on track to hit 75% renewable energy by 2025. Even the state energy minister, the current one, admits that we're on track to meet that. How do you feel, South Australian voting public, about 100% renewable energy target by 2030? The results came back and 69% of South Australians support that policy. And it just shows how popular renewable energy is in this state. The last little bit of polling I wanted to run you through, this is polling that hasn't been released publicly yet, so you're the first people who are getting to hear it. I'll run through a couple of questions quickly. One of the questions was, do you believe Australia is facing a climate change emergency and should take emergency action? This is national numbers. 59% of Australians agreed with that statement. Do you believe we could stabilise our climate if government took on the mission of building a zero carbon economy? 53% of people agreed with that. Do you believe we already have the solutions we need to stop dangerous climate change, but the only thing stopping us is the politics? 63% of Australians agreed with that. And we asked, do you think that governments should mobilise all of society to tackle climate change like they mobilised everyone during the world wars? 53% of Australians agree with that statement. These numbers are important, I think, because they tell us a couple of key bits of information. They, to me, show that the argument has moved on, and it's no longer about whether global warming or climate change is real. It's no longer about whether human activity is impacting the climate. It's now a question of how quickly are we going to be able to facilitate a just transition away from fossil fuels, and how important is it to the nation that we move in that direction economically and environmentally and socially. These numbers, we'll put them out publicly in the next week or so, and it paints a very strong picture of the mandate any future government will have to tackle global warming and just how bloody much the Australian public want them to get on with it.
Thanks very much, Noah. We might turn to our political candidates now. The science is very clear, and Noah's just shown us that the public mandate is in fact very clear. What do you think, what actions or specific policies should Australia implement to ensure we meet our objectives under the Paris Agreement? Would you like to start, Senator Hanson-Young?
Well, thank you. And thank you both, Corey and Noah, for that stark introduction, both the doom and then the desire for action from the community. Look, there's a couple of key things we need to do if we're serious about reducing the catastrophic impacts of climate change, notwithstanding what Corey said about the sliding scale. We can all kind of we could just sit on our hands and say, oh, well, it's all too hard. But A, I don't think any of us want to see that happen, and B, we're actually, as political leaders and policymakers, being called to account by the public to do something more than that. So one of the first things we need to do is commit and deliver a 100% renewable energy target by 2030. It is doable and it's essential. That's the first thing. But we also need to be, as the Paris Agreement has suggested, we need to be getting out of fossil fuels. And we can't be getting out of fossil fuels if we continue to open new coal mines and starting to sink new oil wells, such as that in the Great Australian Bight. This is where the rubber hits the road and where there does end up being a political diversion in a very stark contrast of this election campaign. The Greens have a very clear policy that we need to phase out fossil fuels and we need to stop no new coal mines, oil and gas. 80% of the world's coal comes from Australia. So when you hear politicians say, well, Australia is only a small part of the world and it doesn't really matter what we do, global warming is everywhere, why should we have to take responsibility for it? You wouldn't accept that if you were in a share house and someone's trashed the corner of the lounge room and you say, oh, well, it's just the corner of the lounge room, you don't have to look at it, you can face the other way, you don't have to worry about it. Well, A, it's not a very moral thing to do and a moral approach to take. But actually, the reality is we are effectively exporting climate change. 80% of the world's coal comes from Australia. We have a huge responsibility as to what we do in relation to that going forward, which is why, of course, we are strongly opposed to the Adani Coal Mine. And in this election, both Labor and the Liberal parties are refusing to even talk about that issue. On one hand, they're out spruiking the benefits of what they believe would be a couple of hundred jobs in Queensland because of the Adani Coal Mine. We have people spruiking maybe, if we're lucky, a couple of hundred jobs from oil and gas here in South Australia. None of them want to deal with the realities that if we are serious about reducing carbon pollution, that means we have to, at the very least, stop opening new coal mines and oil wells.
Thank you. Senator Storer, would you like to add something?
Okay, righto, thank you. Well, I think from my perspective that we need to remember that our commitments to the Paris Agreement to reduce by 26 to 28% of from 2005 levels is part of what we agreed at Paris. We also agreed that we would move significantly beyond these levels. And that's part of the agreement in itself, which is often overlooked. And I think as one of the highest per capita basis of emissions countries, we should be certainly doing our fair share, but also going beyond those levels. So I certainly think the calls for 45% or beyond that is very absolutely required. And I think that the renewables, particularly with regards to electricity, which is 34% of our emissions, is a pathway that we can absolutely push further with in terms of the production of our electricity through these things. I've been seeing myself firsthand at things like the largest solar farm in the Southern Hemisphere at Bangarra, next to Port Augusta, and also Whyalla in terms of the not just solar farm, but pumped hydro projects. So we get it in South Australia in terms of the ability of renewable energy to provide that target. Then, of course, there's other sectors that need to respond, and transport is 19%, and I think electric vehicles is very much in vogue. And speaking in the last month or so, I'd like to think that some of the contribution to that came from the Senate inquiry, which I initiated and chaired last year on electric vehicles, and which we reported on in the end of January. We had a consensus report, but with the call for national targets and a government fleet target. But in my additional comments, I actually put some more rubber on the road in terms of what we need to do there, and it is pleasing at least that the ALP have put forward a government fleet target of 50% in 2025 and their aforementioned target of 50% by 2030, in stark contrast to the government, which was a plan to have a plan and not much more beyond that. I also think that We need to remember that energy efficiency is often talked about as one of the easiest ways that we can promote renewables in our electricity generation. What do we mean by that in terms of not just industry but also residential and commercial, and it also has incredible health outcomes. If our buildings are more energy efficient, it actually provides far more public health savings to the people within them and generally, but it also means that there's less electricity being generated, and predominantly at the moment in Australia through the use of those old, inefficient coal-fired power stations. I think 135 power outages last year from coal-fired power stations. So they're not working well, and it's certainly time to move forward on that. These are initiatives that we can do. Agriculture, we should be doing a lot more with land clearing. Agriculture is 15% of our emissions, and industry is 30%. And we need to bring down that safeguard level, which applies to many big major companies of, I think it's 100 kilotons or something like that a year. Bring that down such that they start having to make reductions in their carbon footprint and start trading whatever they're doing with perhaps also additional land clearing abatement from the agricultural sector. So these are things that I think I've been trying to push, but also very cognizant of in my role as an independent senator in the last year.
Thank you very much. Just back to renewables. Joint research by ANU and the University of Melbourne shows that a transition from coals to renewables is not only required and inevitable, but the economy is actually already naturally heading that way. Renewables are cheaper and cleaner, but both major parties while in government have continued to subsidise the fossil fuel industry. If we don't plan for a transition to a low carbon economy, we'll be forced to transition quickly and more painfully. I might direct this question to Professor Pocock and back to Senator Storer. I believe you both have economics backgrounds. Can you tell us what needs to happen to ensure a just transition to renewable energies? How can we give business certainty to operate within and ensure no one gets left behind, including those working in the fossil fuel industries?
Such a good question, because transitions are painful, and we know this in our own state and city. We look at, for example, the transition that Holden workers have endured in recent years, the Mitsubishi workers before them, and there are such powerful lessons for the way to do things in a good or a bad way from our own experience. And we've got experience up and down the Murray on that. You know, my grandfather planted orange trees and his son had to pull them out. Those transitions, when we move from product to product, are very painful for the people who are actually holding down the job, doing the thing that we need to get rid of. And we know from much research that forward planning is critical. It's absolutely vital that we think ahead for what's going to happen in the Hunter Valley. And anywhere where we have significant coal employment. We can make plans which will make a difference, and we can really target employment growing activities around the regions where we are transitioning. Latrobe Valley has also seen very painful, sudden shifts in energy patterns, and government can make such a difference to look after not just the individual workers in those sectors, but their families and their communities. So planning ahead and investing. And I'm really proud to be running for a party which has promised to invest $1 billion around the coal industry hotspots where the transition will be very significant. We mustn't do it instantaneously. We need to do it gradually over time. Can I just add that in the seat of Adelaide, we've done a lot of door knocking in the last couple of months. Some of the door knockers are here. They've worn out the shoe leather doing it. We've knocked on over 5,000 doors. And what we're hearing from Adelaide residents is very much in support of what you've said, Noah, which is people understand the science, they get it, and they want their governments to act. It's the most talked about issue, the conversion to renewables, the need to lower emissions, and alongside that, the need to protect our water sources in our state as well. So the river is also a hot topic of climate discussion in this state. And in Adelaide, we should be able to assist the transition. One more thing, I know we're going to talk more about Adani, but if we go for the kinds of emissions targets that the unambitious major parties are going for, they're so far behind the trajectories of where we're going to get with renewables that they'll actually cost jobs if we went down as low as they go. We need to be much more ambitious and build the research, development and employment capability in the renewable sector.
Thank you.
Well, I guess I'll just echo, many of them very well said, Barbara, and I think that in your travels, if you go and speak to people in the renewable areas, you'll find that many of them, for example, the people at the Bangarra solar farm, many of them were employed by the previous power station there, and now have found work in that farm and other opportunities. Whyalla, they're speaking about the problems of getting skilled workers to come there to work on many of the projects. One of the things about Adani is the purported number of jobs, which was always thrown around as 10,000, but has come down to be a bit more realistic, maybe 1,000 jobs. And contrast to a company in Brisbane that we visited in the electric vehicles inquiry, Tritium, who are making world-leading superchargers, the ones that do charge your cars in 8 minutes, as per the opposition leader's claim, which was rubbish but actually proven to be true. Tritium employed 250 people, and they've come from that from over a couple of years. So it's an example of that the renewable sector can employ many people, and if we unleash it more, it will fill many jobs. Of course, transitions in different areas is painful, and but that's why we need to have a ability for the government to provide funding in social services and R&D and development like that, and not provide corporate tax cuts which reduce our ability to do so.
Thank you. So on Adani, let's pretend for a moment that the traditional owners had approved the mine, that Adani had actually passed all local environmental requirements, that they weren't going to use a whole heap of water consumption that our local farmers don't have access to, that they weren't going to threaten waterways and native species that are already endangered, and that they weren't going to open up a gateway to more coal mines in the Galilee Basin. Let's pretend that they didn't have a dodgy history, that we weren't giving them humongous tax subsidies, and that they were delivering the tens of thousands of jobs originally promised. Let's pretend all of that. How still can we be approving this mine when we've just heard that the result of what's going to happen if we open any more coal mines, and we know that this one is going to release billions of tonnes of emissions into our atmosphere?
Good question. And wouldn't it be good if we could just put aside all of those other terrible things that keep lining up as to why we're also opposed to Adani? But your question actually goes to the fact that none of the assessments, and this is a problem with our current environmental laws, none of the assessments even take into consideration climate and the impact on the broader environment or the planet of climate change. So we actually need an overhaul of the rules and regulations that politicians and bureaucrats and those assessing these projects look at, because on Tuesday or Wednesday morning, when it was announced that Adani had got the final approval for their groundwater application by the Federal Environment Minister, I could hear from the talkback radio and the emails coming in, Australians right across the country were very confused. Well, hang on a minute, how could the CSIRO and how could the Environment Department sign off on this when we know it's going to be so bad for climate change? It's because that isn't even the question that's being asked. The assessment for this project has nothing to do with climate change, and it's a big, big part of the problem. So twofold, we can't discount all of those other terrible things. And Adani has already been fined twice in Queensland for not doing the right thing, breaching the rules that are meant to be kind of governing their operations thus far. So they've already done the wrong thing in Australia. You look at their record overseas and they've got a long list of things that they have not done properly, not to mention hiding tax money in the Cayman Islands. But if you come back to the pure issue of climate change, we've got to change our laws. We have to have a climate trigger in our environmental assessments. And I think this needs to be going forward. You wouldn't have a plan for drilling in the Bight if we had federal laws that had to consider whether climate change would be impacted, whether carbon emissions and the impact of these projects would make climate change worse. So we need a climate trigger in our laws that the bureaucrats and the politicians have to take into account.
Thank you. Senator Storer. Can I just ask, if re-elected this year, is that something that you would support? Changing the laws so that they do have to consider the climate?
Well, it seems, sorry about that, it seems like a very valid proposition. There's even considerations that don't occur in the current Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act with regards to drilling in the Bight that has been ceded that NOPSEMA, the independent authority, would just make a decision based on really safety, technical aspects. They don't include ecological sustainability, concern from the community, adverse effects, and other aspects that are within the Act already. And so that's why I've been proposing that those things should be a second step. So I guess like Sarah has just mentioned, that climate change should be, included in these assessments of Adani and other aspects. But I guess the problem at the moment is that we have a minister such as Minister Canavan who's let slip that he is the Minister for Coal. And it was said not so much as a joke, but as a statement. He's the minister.
Proudly.
He's the Minister for Coal in terms of coal-fired power stations, but also in terms of exports of coal. And coal has export revenues of 66 billion to Australia, and 35 billion of that 66 is in Queensland. And Queensland has many marginal seats, and so it flows that this is what is occurring on a political level with regards to the Adani mine.
Thank you. On that note, Minister for Coal, our actual next question was that given the science and the public mandate is clear, it is really hard to understand why our government wouldn't be taking sufficient urgent action on climate change. And we're just wondering, what are your thoughts on politicians and parties accepting donations from fossil fuel industries? And what policies could we put in place to ensure that our democracy cannot be bought by big business? Yeah, please.
Yeah. I think that's the backstory to everything that Sarah has said and Tim has said. Our politics are contaminated by millions of dollars which are flowing to those major parties and very sharply and obviously affecting the policies around mine approval. And it's really interesting. Your stats on Queensland are so important. The Queensland politics are so complex. But their independent research has shown, for example, that creating that mine in Queensland will actually cost over 10,000 jobs in the Hunter Valley, because we'll be flooding the world with coal in a mine that will be automated from mine to port. So the people employed in that mine, it'll be the most lean employment structure probably in a coal mine in the world, because it's so newly created, and that has the effect of reducing employment in many other parts of the state, especially in New South Wales. So, we've got some complex politics that are playing out, but none of this should be about politics. It should be about science and the community. And money buys decisions which are against the science and against the interests of the larger Australian community.
Can I just add there, Barbara? Just last financial year alone, Labor and Liberal took almost $1 million from the fossil fuel industry in donations. That's just hard cash to the party. That's not the added dinners and wine and dining that these companies do in Canberra all the time for their, the Minister for Coal or whoever else. That's just hard cash to their political parties is $1 million, just last financial year alone. Imagine what it would be this year in an election year. Adani's given $50,000 already to the Liberal Party and to One Nation, and I'm sure at the end of the financial year there'll be much more disclosed.
That's a key point, as Sarah's just mentioned, at the end of the financial year, and because the present ruling is that these such donations in a political year, in an election year, is 24 weeks, or 16 weeks, 16 weeks that they have to disclose, and 24 weeks after it is disclosed. And that's an election year. In a non-election year, it's basically annually. So I was very pleased that Sarah and all of her colleagues and others of the crossbench signed a parliamentary transparency charter that we had passed in the Senate in the last week of our sitting. And one of the aspects of it was as close to practical real-time disclosure of donations of over $1,000 or more. Presently, the level is 13,800. You can do 13,700 many times. It won't be disclosed. And as I said, it takes 16 weeks, 24 weeks realistically in an election year. So many of the donations that are being made now will not be known until the end of the year. And so this would improve the understanding of the community in terms of what donations are being made and where, and also other aspects of the Transparency Charter are to do with lobbyists and disclosing what meetings are going on in ministers and what lobbyist groups, both in-house and third party, are meeting with ministers.
So transparency is a fantastic start, but is there a way we can actually legislate to put a limit on these donations?
Yes, well...
I'm not a lawmaker, let the lawyer...
Yes, there can be, and other countries have done it. In fact, other state parliaments have already put caps on the amount of donations that can be given. I think the disclosure is absolutely essential. Caps are important. But actually, one of the things that often flies under the radar, and Tim started to touch on this, is the revolving door between ministers' offices, former ministers' offices, the lobby groups and the companies themselves. So when you look at NOPSEMA, for example, the agency that's meant to be making an independent assessment about drilling in the Bight, notwithstanding the fact they're not assessing the right things, they're only looking at a very, very narrow set of objectives, but the people who run the show in NOPSEMA, a large number of them have come from the previous governments. The previous resource minister was on the board for a while. We've had chief of staffs from various companies and minister's office sitting on that board. So it's not just the money that's being handed over, it's the power of the people making the decisions. And the revolving door of lobbyists is a big, big problem.
NOPSEMA is a great example of an area of this relationship between lobbyists and the parties and the companies that are looking to exploit the natural resources in Australia. So relatively recently, in just the last few months, something called the Foreign Transparency Register has been brought in, where foreign companies and agents and governments who are working and lobbying in the Australian system are listed now on a transparent register. And one of the first series of listings included 3 entries from Equinor, the Norwegian company that's looking to drill for oil in the Great Australian Bight. Now, they were listed on there because they are majority owned by the Norwegian government. And because of that quirk, we get a little bit of an insight into the sort of full court press of lobbying that these companies do that is often kept pretty much entirely behind closed doors. And the lobbying work that multiple high-profile lobbying firms have been employed to do for Equinor specifically is targeting the major parties, but also NOPSEMA, the regulating body that oversees approval for these sorts of things. It's a really important area of transparency and accountability, along with donation reform, that needs to be looked at more closely.
And of course, the biggest issue in all of this is if you offer a donation, what do you expect in return? And that's where we actually desperately need a federal anti-corruption body. The fact that we don't have one is extraordinary, I think, in Australia right now. We've got them in different states. I think if we had an ICAC, what's going on with the Bight, what's going on with Adani, and what's been happening with the big corporate cotton growers in the Murray-Darling Basin, all of those issues would be up front first as things to look into.
Thank you. Now, just a warning to our audience, we're getting close to your Q&A time, so this is about your last chance to text in your question. Now, sadly, this afternoon, we have reflected on stage, I think, what too often happens in our society. We've been listening to everybody's point of view except for the youngest member on stage. So, Doha, young people are going to suffer... Actually get really emotional. Got two young nephews that this brings to mind. Young people are going to suffer the most from our inaction on climate change. You have been really active in leading the Adelaide part of the global youth strike movement. Can you tell us any interactions you've had with our political leaders, and are they listening to you?
So my team and I, we've had the chance to talk to a lot of politicians and really bring this issue close to them, with the hope that they will be more willing to recognise it and act on it. And I suppose that's kind of like been a bit of a wake-up call. I really realised that politicians, they seem to be more concerned with playing politics than actually, delivering and doing what is needed. I know that I've sat on meetings with members from the major parties, and they're more concerned with pushing the fact that their targets, their renewable energy targets, are better than those of the opposition. But that's just not good enough, because the international body of research, the scientists have told us that we need 100% renewables by 2030. Yet the highest that the major parties are offering us are 50%. I think any reasonable person with any basic mathematical abilities would be able to recognise that that's just not good enough. And it really shows that the major parties, while they're kind of they're not listening to the important bits of what we're saying. We're asking for climate action. They're giving us just a tiny bit of what is needed, and that's really not good enough.
So a final question, especially to our political candidates here today and political members. Climate change has been a really, really divisive issue in Australia. But in contrast, in our neighbour New Zealand, in 2016, a group of MPs from across the political spectrum worked together on a plan to transition their country to a low-emission economy. We know there are actually people across the political spectrum here in Australia who do believe in climate change and do think we need to act on it. Is there a way that we can bring them together to move Australia forward despite the blockers?
Well, it's essential that we make that happen, and that's the reality, and that's what we've heard today in relation to the science. It's what we're hearing from the constituents and the community, is that young and old, people want us to act, and so we have to. And I guess this is why this election is so important, because this is the climate election. And when we talk about those findings and the report from the IPCC and how doomsday some of those elements are, we have elections every 3 years, and we're being told we have to take drastic and urgent action within the next 10. So we don't have 3 years to waste. We can't get to the end of May 18 and think, oh, well, next time, we'll try next time. There is no next time. It has to happen now. And whoever is elected as Prime Minister, and I can understand why people are perhaps frustrated that there's no representatives from Labor and Liberal up here. But whoever is elected as Prime Minister, whether it is Bill Shorten or Scott Morrison, they will not, on their own, control the Senate. So you'll have the government formed in the lower house, and then you'll have the Senate. And it's up to the Senate to hold both the Labor and Liberal parties to account, and on this issue. And for us as a minor party like the Greens or Independents to work together to make sure we actually get strong environment and climate laws passed. We have done it before. We did it in 2010 and it was a successful package, world leading actually, under the Gillard government. And she did that as a Prime Minister under a huge amount of pressure from her own side. Remember, Kevin Rudd was trying to tear her down right from the beginning. And she had a minority government in the House and minority government, and the Greens had the balance of power in the Senate. And together we worked to have world-leading climate laws. That's what we need to see happen again. Because while Labor does not have a plan to transition from coal, oil or gas, and while we have the knuckle draggers in the Liberal Party who are holding their party back, we actually need to make sure the Senate steps up and holds people to account and we get those things through. I feel quite optimistic that this election, every member who is re-standing or candidates that are putting their hand up are being asked over and over again, what are you going to do on climate change? From members of the community like yourselves and others, Barbara said, you know, it's the key issue when people get door knocked. The Australian community are demanding action. Here in South Australia, it is in the top 3 issues that people are saying they're going to vote on, what type of climate policy a political party has. So just think about that when you do go to vote, or if you're helping out on election day. There is a very key role for the Senate in this moment, and we have to make not just the climate election, but the climate election that actually makes the difference and delivers climate change action and some actual change of policy.
Well, a lot of very good things said there by Sarah, and I would echo many or much, or if not all of it. Yes, there is significant focus in terms of climate change in this election, and we're seeing it not just in South Australia, but in many seats in other parts of Australia as well, where independents and becoming new prospects against incumbents, but usually often against the incumbent coalition members. But in some other seats there, it's a real prospect to push the ALP to move even further from where they are and where they've been in terms of climate change and related aspects. So we could have certainly significant role for independents in the lower house, but also in the Senate, where it's very important, given the strength of some of the more right-wing and far right-wing parties and groups and incumbents within, let's say, particularly the Nationals and One Nation and the like, who don't agree and have clearly significant backing from groups that are not wishing to move as fast forward as the population. And I think, as touched upon, the population is ahead of many of those groups, and we need to return people to the House of Representatives and the Senate that are in line with what the population wants. Yeah, thank you.
I totally agree with everything that's just been said, but I return to your question, Noah, your survey question about World War II. I think we are moving into a crisis. We can see it in major cattle deaths, in storms, we can see it in bushfires. That's why the Australian community is coming back. They see it, and they are ahead of their elected representatives in many parts of the country. We've had this 10 years of real significant dishonesty and greed for political power and greed to wring the last dollar out of our coal industry before coal truly, the planet, forces us to switch out of coal. And I think the community is moving away from that dishonesty. They see it and they are very conscious about that greed is driving such significant public policy outcomes. So I feel optimistic about the population, but I do worry about what money buys us politically. If you drive down this street, it is paved with pictures of Labor and Liberal candidates. Parties who don't take money from big corporations don't get the airplay on our TVs or on our streets. So money is a significant problem in the election, and I really hope that the electors, when they get in there with their pencil, make the decision that their values line up with, rather than just vote the corflute they just saw or the TV ad.
So now we'll turn to your questions, and I apologise if we don't get through them all. I might put you on the spot and start with you, Doha. And I'm happy to take anyone's answer to this one. How do we take the discussions and points from today out into mainstream discussion?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I think, just making sure that you are taking the opportunities to attend candidate forums like this. I know there's a bunch coming up later this week, and just really making sure that the realizations that you've developed here, listening to all these panelists, are really heard by the major parties who aren't able to be here. It's important that we bring climate change and action on climate change to the forefront of any debate that our candidates are having, and just really making sure that this is an issue that matters to their constituents, and this is an issue that we want, our concerns about to be represented in Parliament.
Well, I think it's happening. It's and I think the student strike really showed that. I went along to the one here in Adelaide, and I was there with my daughter and a bunch of her school friends, and I don't think I've been to something in quite some time where I felt genuinely inspired and hopeful, because despite what the science is telling us, people are saying, no, we're not going to just take this lying down. We actually are going to demand action and demand that the adults, the politicians, do something. I just wish you were all 18 and on the electoral roll. But this is a good point, because we actually need to make sure that people who are worried about these issues, and increasingly young people are, for obvious reasons, because there is the generations before have not taken this issue seriously. They've banked all the profits. They've invested in their third or fourth house. They've done it on negative gearing. There's no money left in the kitty for well-funded public education, and now they're not going to take action on climate change. No wonder the young people are pretty upset right now. So we actually have to get those young people who can vote on the roll and ready to vote on May 18. And I think having that conversation is really important. On Thursday night at 8 p.m, the rolls close. We've only got a week to either update your electoral details, so if you've moved house, or to get enrolled. It's very easy. You can do it online. There's 44,000 people here in South Australia who are eligible to be on the roll, but they're not. If 44,000 people were on the roll, that could change the election. It could significantly change what the Senate would look like. It could easily change what happens in the seat of Adelaide or Boothby or in Sturt. 44,000 people who are not on the roll. And the majority of those people are young people. So if you go away out of this room, one thing that you can do this week is have a think about the young people in your life and make sure, if they've turned 18 sometime between the last election and now, make sure they're on the roll. If you know someone's moved house, make sure they update their details. It's very, very easy. aec.gov.au/enrol. It's very, very easy to do. It takes about 5 minutes, not even. But people actually have the power to have their voice heard this election, and we don't want them to waste it. New citizens as well, that's right, absolutely.
Would anyone else like to respond to that question? How do we get the discussion out into the mainstream?
Well, I think the key point is that there's an immediate opportunity right now, which is the coming election, but it's also a question of further discussions people have with their families and friends, and actions that they take, and perhaps even involvement in groups like your own here that I'm sure will be going on beyond the election, and to take part in polls when called upon by people like the Australia Institute and the like. But obviously, a key thing is that there's an opportunity to reflect opinions such as we've been discussing today, and that's in just over 5 weeks' time, or just under 5 weeks' time.
I've got a question here. If the major political parties are out of step with both the science and the public, is democracy a system capable of delivering what's needed? There's a curveball for you.
Think World War II and Churchill. Like, you know, democracy is set aside in crisis in some ways. And I mean, Churchill was the guy who said, you know, democracy's hopeless, but you know, it's the best. It's the best we've got. And I think there is a real disjuncture, and there's two ways that disjuncture between what people think and what politicians do. It can go in the direction of complete cynicism and withdrawal. And I know a lot of people, I bet you do too, people have just given up. They just stop reading the paper, they think it's all rubbish, think it's all lies. The other way it can go, and I've got to say that's for me, the only reason I'm running is because I think democracy is really fragile and you have to put your hand up sometimes. So having the conversation and getting involved is the healthier way, because we don't have another system. But crisis will force emergency powers, it will change democracy, but it's really important that those of us, not just us, the people we disagree with also, get engaged and involved in the politics to protect our democracy. Because if we don't have people engaged, as my father always said, a Mallee farmer who voted Liberal till he died, you get the government you deserve.
Yeah, but also I think, just as a young person, because I've been to meetings with like people like Kate Ellis, the ALP, like an ALP member, and I don't necessarily think that democracy is like a barrier to climate change. I think that we can, you know, democracy is something we can use to get the climate action we need. I think that as long as, you know, political parties, or maybe just Labor, sees that there's a massive, overwhelming community mandate to get climate action, I think that, you know, we can use democracy, in our favour.
I think people's... Well done. I agree with you, and I think people's vote is more powerful than ever before on this issue. The community wants it. The politicians, most politicians, know, whether they're in Labor or the Liberal parties and they're kind of hesitant about what to do is another issue. But this is the moment to send them a really strong message. This is the moment to use your vote and the influence that you have amongst your friends and your family to encourage them to vote, to send a really strong message that you want climate action. People's vote is powerful. And Barb, you talk about democracy, you know, going one or two ways. And we need to, I agree with you, we need to engage and we need to encourage people to be more engaged rather than withdraw. Because I tell you what, the big corporations like Adani and the others who are, you know, trying to bank profits off the kind of dying days of the fossil fuel industry, they don't think democracy is broken. They think it's working pretty well for them right now. They're not going to vacate the field if we're not there. It's not a game for them. They're in there getting everything they can right now, and we have to step up and match it.
I have a question here for you, Professor Bradshaw. What does Corey think political priorities for climate change should be?
Well, being just a lowly scientist, I can't compete with the politicians on lawmaking, but I do agree with most things that have been said. I think I could go a little bit further and say that I don't think we actually have a democracy. We haven't had one for a very long time. We live in a plutocracy, and it's as opposed to making things fully disclosed, having caps on donations, we should have caps on total amounts received. We should actually have taxpayer-funded political campaigns. And as soon as you have differential investment, you lose democracy, because the decisions made thereafter essentially render the voting process illegitimate. That's my personal view. We also have a ridiculous system in Australia called preference voting, which gets people like Fraser Anning elected. This is a big problem. Now, I'm not a lawmaker, I'm not a political scientist, so I'll try to stop it there. But it goes a little bit farther our environmental legislation has been raised tonight is woefully weak, and it's only implemented in cases of a very dubious assignment of threat status. It doesn't take into consideration the connectivity of the landscape, it does not take into consideration climate change, it does not take into consideration the local population versus the species. There's a lot of problems. It's one of the most underinvested departments in any legislation, state or federal. And so unless we put a lot more emphasis on our environment, and I'm not just talking climate change, I'm talking reforestation, I'm talking about anti-clearing laws. Do you know in South Australia, this is state level, we have also a big disconnect between state and federal legislation, but our Native Vegetation Act, 1991, can be completely sidestepped if the sitting minister decides that a major development, completely arbitrary epithet, usually brought on by heavy lobbying, says that it's a major development and therefore you can clear whatever you want. So in other words, we have this impotent and completely sidestepped legislation. These are easy fixes. These are strokes of pens. We can get over those now. Now, politically, yes, obviously continue to vote, but we have to, I'm going to go a little bit farther, and I'm going to say too that it works both ways in terms of science denial. I'm probably well known for this, but I think our mantra shouldn't be 100% renewables, and this is where I differ from the Greens quite a bit. I think it should be 0% carbon. And anything that allows us to get there fast as possible should be good. This is why I'm very strong a proponent for making nuclear power legal in Australia. And this is another reason why, for example, Germany closing its nuclear power plants, its per capita emissions have gone up. So I think we need a very mature conversation in this country about all the technologies being allowed on the table. But that's, I know I've just dropped a bomb out there. Do with it what you will. But I think we need to think emergency, and we need to think in not just century scale, decadal scale stuff. We don't have the time.
Now you've got a fire pattern.
That's what we're on.
So I just want to say something about nuclear. It's not going to work for us. It's too expensive. It takes too long to build, and no country on the planet has worked out how to dispose of their high-level nuclear waste, which is a consequence of nuclear power. So it's not a solution. And our state had a real...
You're incorrect. But anyway.
Well, our state had a really good look at it. We spent $10 million asking our community and doing the research on it. And, it is not a goer. Even in Finland, they have not put their waste in the ground safely yet, where they have built their disposal. So that's one issue. The other thing I want to speak in defence of is our preference system, because Fraser Anning didn't get into Parliament because of our preference system. That was the way
he got there because Pauline Hanson put him on her ticket.
Yeah, exactly. Our preference system actually is a healthy thing for our democracy, in my belief. In my view, others may want to say something about it as well, because it allows us in this coming election, for example, to vote for a green ticket, someone like me in Adelaide, and then go with 100% flow of your preference to the party of your choice after that. If I'm not elected, then your preference gets a second shot to choose that major party outcome. In a country like the US, when you're voting for your election, someone like Ralph Nader or any third party in a presidential race just splits the Democrat or the Republican vote. So I know it's complex, and this is not a tutorial about voting systems, but preference voting is a positive thing, I believe, in our Australian democracy.
Can I just say, we've got a little bit of time left and a couple more questions. These are great conversations, and I think we should be having them. And if anyone has time to stay here afterwards, grab a drink or some food at Roxy's bar next door. Let's keep having these conversations. Another question. With water being key to life, can we stop Adani because of what they would do to our water?
Has the Murray-Darling Basin Authority worked? No.
The approval that was given last week, I think is already starting to be picked to pieces. It sounds as though the reports and the kind of purported reports of what the CSIRO and Geoscience Australia gave the Minister in relation to those groundwater approvals are very kind of surface level. that was a bad pun, sorry. A very kind of basic. It doesn't actually go down to a number of other issues. It comes back again to the strength of the environment laws in Canberra. But also, it now seems as though the Queensland government, the ball is in their court on the water aspects. But Corey actually makes a good point. I mean, it's not just Adani that's the problem and the impact that they might have on the water table below, but it's also, even when we do have a national authority that's meant to manage the Murray-Darling Basin so that we could actually put more water back into the river, because we know if we don't do that, it's going to keep dying. The fish kills over summer were extraordinary. And it was one of those issues that really struck at the heart of what is going on. We are the driest continent on Earth, and we just don't manage our water properly at all. And at a time when we've got laws and a regulator that says, in the dry times, big corporate irrigation can continue to take water out of the river to a point where there's not going to be enough left to keep it flowing, to stop those algae blooms, to stop those fish kills. There is a serious problem with the way the Murray-Darling Basin is being managed. There was this plan put in place, and it didn't do what the science had advised. The scientists, had been a lot of work, had gone through what the bare minimum needed to be if we were to save the Murray-Darling Basin, and they said the bare minimum would need to be 4,000 gigalitres returned to the river. But you'd also have to model climate change in that, and the drying weather patterns and the low runoffs into the river. But at the bare minimum, you'd have to return 4,000 gigalitres of water back to the river. That means buying water licences off the big irrigators. That's not what happened. Politics got in the way, and a political compromise was delivered. And now we have a plan that says we deliver 2,750 gigalitres, well below the 4,000, but even that is now dubious. Water that is meant to have been returned hasn't been returned, and it never took into consideration climate change at all. So we have a long, long way to go if we're to fix the Murray-Darling Basin. And talk about crisis, it is a crisis. In the town of Wilcannia, there's one town on the Darling River there, they now can't turn the tap on and drink the water or do anything with the water that comes out the tap in that town. It is so contaminated and so poisonous that they're having to truck in bottled water for the town. This is in Australia. This is on the Murray-Darling Basin. Wilcannia used to be known as the inland port town. The river was so big and flowing that they'd have paddle steamers going up and down it. And now it is so bad, they can't even drink the water that comes out of the tap, let alone wash in it. So we've got a long way to go, and it is a crisis, and we need to fix it. One of the key things we've got to do is have a federal royal commission, but we also have to put an immediate embargo on those big corporate irrigators that are taking water out when there's no water even to flow down the river as it is. So.
I'd like to answer this one. After we vote on May 18th, either Labor or Coalition will form government, and there's a bracket, hopefully minority. Neither party is serious about climate change. What can we do to influence the government that wins the election to act on climate change?
Yeah, we touched on this earlier, but the most obvious way that any government of the day is influenced when it comes to how they legislate the promises that they make and how they're held to account is via the Senate. And it's great to have a couple of our senators here tonight. We do polling around the country on a range of issues, but we're also one of very few organisations that do polling on how people are planning to vote in the Senate. One of the things that have come out from that analysis is just how important the race here in South Australia, and specifically the race for the Senate seats, is going to be. One thing we know for certain is that after the next election, neither the Coalition nor Labor, whichever of them forms government, neither of them will have a majority in the Senate. So there will be negotiations, there will be strong scrutiny on any legislation that they try and put through. In South Australia, there's quite a crowded race for the Senate seats, and we have quite a strong history of electing minor party candidates, micro party candidates, and independents in South Australia. Each election in each state, 6 Senate seats are up for grabs. It's half of the Senate in each election. And in South Australia, 2 of them will most likely go to the Labor Party, 2 of those 6 will likely go to the Liberal Party, and then it's basically an all-in race between all of the independents and the minor parties, the micro parties and the major parties to take those last 2 available seats. That includes the Senate candidates we have on stage, but it also includes the likes of One Nation and the Australian Conservatives, the United Australia Party, a whole range of people are vying for those seats. And with a finely balanced Senate, who is elected here in Tasmania and to some extent potential races in Victoria is largely going to decide the outcome of the balance of power in the Senate, whether it be independent and Greens or whether it be One Nation and Australian Conservatives. It's a tight race and it's one thing to be watching on election day.
You want to add something?
Oh, well, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think we can all agree that the big concern is the One Nation, Australian Conservatives and UAP, United Australia, the big push in terms of advertising, could deliver in a senator from South Australia, from one of those parties, and I don't believe that would reflect at all, as per your polling, what South Australians would want in terms of in particular, let's say in terms of the climate change and from what we've heard. So I think it's very important for electors to consider that and to, I think we can all agree on that. And I just wanted to say very quickly, I agree with you regarding preferential system and nuclear. I'm not with you there. I'm with Sarah a lot on terms of the Murray-Darling, and I think a very key aspect is that there's been a lot of furphy about jobs and the like in terms of the irrigators in the Murray-Darling area, and studies have shown that more focus on actually returning more water to the environment via water buybacks to certain irrigators would deliver 3 to 4 times as many jobs as the current focus, which is on these efficiency projects, which sound great in principle, but actually consume a lot more of our taxpayers' money for a lesser return in terms of jobs and growth, which you would think that coalition with having that, trying to own that moniker would be consider their first priority, but it's not. Thank you.
So after our final question, please do, if you can, stay on at Roxy's next door, grab a drink or dinner, keep chatting, support the venue here. We may be holding another forum before the election. Did I just say that out loud? It may depend how many other people put their hands up to help us. So Lynn, if you wouldn't mind waving at the door. If you're not already on our mailing list, then come and have a chat to Lynn and sign up if you'd like to be kept in touch. We're all busy, we will not be spamming you, we'll just let you know if we're doing an event or action that we think is important that you might want to know about. And finally, again, just thank you all so much for coming out today. As a group of friends who have spent a crazy 3 weeks outside work and family and sickness organising this, it means a lot that you guys care and that you would come along to this forum and show that we're not the only ones that care. It's really, really encouraging. So thank you. Give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you. Final question. We might start with Noah and work our way down this end of the panel, if that's all right. Can you tell us, we'd love to leave this on a positive note, what's one thing that the audience can do to help climate action?
So we had a bit of a conversation before about political engagement and what the ways that people can respond, whether it's becoming disenfranchised and fed up with the system or getting involved. And one of the pieces of advice we give to people who want to become politically engaged is come to a forum, ask questions and get involved in that way. you've already leveled up to that point, so now you have to go further. You have to take it to the professional level, and I think the next steps for, if you really want to become engaged, are things like joining a political party. For a think tank, it's not for us to tell you which party, but to look at what's available out there and get involved yourselves, joining a political party. If you're already a member of a political party, get 2 or 3 of your friends to join up and then volunteer your time. It's fantastic that you're able to come to an event like this and have the discussion, but then taking a deep dive and getting politically engaged is an important next step.
Exactly. The best antidote to depression about the state of the planet is action. So I would really encourage you to think about handing out on election day, on polling day. That really makes a difference to how people think, what gets handed to them. You'd be amazed how many people actually make their mind up on the day. So if you're interested in doing that for the Greens, please catch me at the end. I'd love to have your assistance. And I think the second thing you can do is, sorry Tim, but vote for Sarah in the Senate. To Tim. Or no, follow the ticket. It really matters. I think Noah has described it really clearly. What we do here in South Australia in the Senate will make a difference to a national policy, and it can go one of 2 ways, and it's got to go the right way.
Okay. Yeah, it was a bit easier. I was at another event during the weekend. There were 2 lower house candidates and me, and so I was able to say, well, you know, do what you want in the lower house, but of course, you know, you can vote separately. So I would certainly push in terms of the options of independence, of evaluation of other people's of their ideas. This is occurring across Australia with regards to many of the other races, and so I would encourage people in South Australia to do the same as well. But of course, that means you know, actually getting out there and considering your vote and looking to assist in the process. So I would echo many of the things Noah has just said then, in terms of that we have a pretty relatively easy, cost-free ability to engage in the political process in Australia compared to many other countries in the world, and so we should cherish and utilise that. Thank you.
I'm just going to say 3 things that have nothing to do with politics. First one, from both a water and a biodiversity and an emissions perspective, eating more of a plant-based diet is going to really help this, the world. Second thing, we need to think about divestments, and that includes, who here has superannuation? Okay, how many of you have actually looked into where your superannuation funds are investing? Well, it's a good number, but most of us haven't. Look at who you're investing with, and that includes also divesting, encouraging your employers to divest from there. For example, we're trying to do that with Flinders University right now. It's a bit opaque and it's a long process, but we're getting there. And the final thing I want to say is, in terms of your carbon footprint, by far and away the biggest contribution you can make above recycling, even eating vegetarian and traveling in an electric car, is choosing about how many children you have. Every single additional child is about a 58 times increase over your personal footprint. So that's going to have long-term benefits for the planet, not just in terms of short-term immediate emissions. So we need to have that conversation as well. Population is a big problem.
This is the perfect opportunity to get involved. We've got 5 weeks until May 18. It is going to be the climate election. It is the climate election. We need people out there on polling booths helping to spread that message. Often people think, oh, well, you know, political parties have it all worked out. It takes people power. And Barb said earlier, you know, we don't have the huge donations that the big political parties have, so we can't put on stacks and stacks of television advertising or direct mail, those kind of letters that arrive in your mailbox. What we need is people. And the difference between having somebody on a polling booth and not having somebody on a polling booth is somewhere between 2 and 3%. And I'm on a margin of less than 1. So if I can't get people on polling booths, I will not be able to get back in there and to fight for climate action for South Australia. And what would happen if that is the case? More likely than not, One Nation or Cory Bernardi's party is going to get elected. And I can guarantee they're not going to act on climate change. So people on polling booths and volunteering your time on May 18, you only need to give us 2 or 3 hours of your time. It will make a huge difference. And it's fun. You get to talk to people about politics and about the issues while you're there, or, you know, you can chat to the other volunteers if you like, talk to the people about the issues. This election, people are more and more engaged, and you're part of that. We can see it here today. It's only week 1 of the election campaign, and you've already come out to your first forum. Do something with that. I've got a volunteer. Wave your hand up there, Bryony. If you want to help on polling day, please let her know. We really need your help. Thank you.
Yeah, so everyone's kind of touched on what I wanted to say. Just this election, I think I just want everyone to really, really, really recognise how important it is, not just, you know, for the whoever the next government is, also just for our future. We have 10 years left. We can't throw away 3 of those to a party that will not act on climate change, that will not consider the futures of, you know, the younger generation, the generations to come. Yeah, just really remembering that. And this election is much larger than just, you know, tax cuts or what your next car will be. It's our futures, and it's going to play a massive role in determining, you know, Australia's role in mitigating the effects of climate change. So please, yeah, consider that as a priority.
Do you want to plug May the 3rd?
Oh yeah. Also, we have another School Strike for Climate has another strike planned, and that's going to be on May the 3rd. This time we're going to be holding strikes outside of MP offices, so federal MP offices. We have chosen like the more problematic ones. So Sarah, you won't be expecting like a crowd, but we've got some planned outside of Penny Wong's office, Nicole Flint's office, Mark Butler and Nick Champion, and also Rebecca Sharkey as well. So yeah, if you're in those electorates, if you're nearby, please make sure you turn out to that, and yeah, stand up in solidarity with the younger generation. Thanks.
My apologies for not being there, but I'm going to be in Canberra protesting about Adani, so I'll be thinking of you. Thank you. Just 2 quick things. One is, you're the best panel I've ever heard. You are great. And that's because you weren't lowered by Labor or Liberal being here, but thanks anyway. But I mainly have come up because I want to congratulate Deanna on her emceeing and thank her.
Thanks, Dad. Please help me in thanking our panel one more time. Thank you so much. Now let's go get a drink at Roxy's.